Well, this is the class of CL, right? Okay. And today we have an extraordinarily special program, and we are very fortunate to be here today to have in our memories for the future someone that's very, very important in our fashion business, and I assume you're all going to stay in the fashion industry. How many of you are fashion design students? Raise your hands high. Marketing, merchandising? Less. Well, Liz, this is very special, and I'm not going to talk too much, I hope. And I'm not going to talk about the details of CL 112 attendance, etc. We'll do that next week because I don't want to waste time today on that kind of matter. And I'm just going to say where in my heart Liz Claiborne, the name, started. When I first came into the fashion industry as a textile designer and stylist, that's when I had the great pleasure of meeting Liz, and she came to the textile company I was at, or I would go to her and we'd work out prints, color, and fabric. She was extraordinary, a real sensitive, feeling artist, and that's why she is Liz Claiborne. And that's been my experience. And I know I met Art Ortenberg, who is here, who wrote the book, rightly so, and the husband of Liz. And we were both from the textile world, same company. And that is my emotional attachment. And I'm not going to say any more because I would like to have you meet Mr. Ortenberg, Art Ortenberg. But before we do, we have also the great privilege of having our president, Dr. Joyce Brown, with us, who will introduce Mr. Ortenberg. Dr. Brown, it's so wonderful to have you with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you, and thank you, Alice. I am really delighted to be here with all of you today to welcome our distinguished guest, Art Ortenberg. You know, this is the kind of event, and Art Ortenberg is the kind of guest that makes an FIT education really so special. It reflects our college's strong ties with the fashion and design industries, and it provides you, our students, with a unique window on all that exciting and ever-changing and expanding world. Art Ortenberg is the husband and partner of the late Liz Claiborne and the co-founder of the Liz Claiborne brand. He has lived one of the fashion world's most extraordinary success stories. He has now written that story in his new book, Liz Claiborne, The Legend, the Woman, the Company. And today he's going to share some of it with you. First, let me set the stage by giving you just a little background, beginning with this quote from a Huffington Post book review. Behind every great designer, there has always been a brilliant business partner who brings a balance of reality to creativity. Liz Claiborne met her perfect match in Art Ortenberg, a young garment industry executive from Newark, New Jersey, who hired her to design dresses in 1956. 20 years later, they created Liz Claiborne Incorporated, one of the most well-known fashion companies in the world, whose success enabled their many further adventures together. That success was indeed extraordinary, and Art will fill you in on the details of that. But I will say that just 10 years later, the company made the Fortune 500 list with sales of $1.2 billion. So there's quite a story to be told. The company's enormous success enabled Art and Liz to leave Liz Claiborne Incorporated in 1989 to seek new adventures. They traveled the world together, and they found a new passion, that being wildlife and nature conservation. Today, the Liz Claiborne Art Ortenberg Foundation, of which Art is a trustee, continues to fund efforts to save endangered species, preserve natural habitats, and end resource depletion and waste around the globe. He is also a senior conservationist of the Wildlife Conservation Society, a founder of the Friends of Montana, and has served on the Board of Governors of the Nature Conservancy, the Board of Directors of the World Wildlife Fund, and the Governing Council of the Wilderness Society. Now, I can't close without noting that Liz Claiborne Incorporated has been a longtime friend and supporter of FIT. In 1986, the college honored the company with FIT's One Company Makes a Difference Award, and we also have been privileged to have, of course, Liz Claiborne scholarships that support many of our students, perhaps some of you, in being able to pursue your dreams. So we have long-standing attachments to this family and to this company, and it is now my distinct pleasure to be able to present Art Ortenberg.
First, a clarification. Can you all hear me properly? Good. The book that you are now holding basically is a story of the life that Liz and I led after we left the company. The last 9 years of our lives were full of a roller coaster fighting off a cancer that in the long run could not be fought off, called peritoneal carcinoma. It's a cancer of the stomach lining, and rather than tumors, etc., little seedlets hide under the stomach lining. When you think you've got them, like guerrilla warfare, they reappear. Well, we had 9 years together fighting off the cancer and living a pretty decent life during periods of remission. And then, as a team, we extended her life as long as we could until the inevitable end came. She died 3 years ago in the month of June. There is a beautiful Liz red urn in which her ashes rest at the 888 Ranch in Canyon Creek, Montana. You would have been amused at the emails and the photographs that went back and forth between the Helena Body and Fender Company, who were enameling the urn until we got it just right. I've often wondered in the interim why Liz's name doesn't shine high among well-known designers of the period. And every time I Wikipedia her, I read Liz Claiborne, designer and entrepreneur. There seemed to have been something about being an entrepreneur that distilled the designer. And yet, well, of course, she was the first woman founder of a Fortune 500 company. She was the first woman chairman of the board of a Fortune 500 company. And the company was dedicated to having itself known strictly as Liz. And the rest of us were virtually hypnotized into thinking that we were the pit crew and she drove the car. And it was our job to get her back on track faster, cleaner than anyone else. And that's what we did. So it was the entrepreneur that really basically, in the long run, became the story and not the designer. The book that you have was first written as almost a study in the gastric system. I had spent so much time involved in the disease, which of course finally got her not only what cancer treatment does to you, which is one track, but what the disease itself does to you, which is track 2. And there I was busily writing away, and I was looking for an editor, and I came across Eric Wilson, who I hope you all know. Eric Wilson writes as a journalist who writes for the New York Times. His job these days in covering this insane period known as Fashion Week is not to cover the designers, but to cover who's sitting in the front row. What a change from the old days. I suggest that when you do look at the book, on page, I believe it's 137, we have Liz's acceptance speech when she received a doctorate at RISD. She says many things in that speech. I think it was 1992, because we had left the company then for at least 3 years. And the company was really basically in the throes of its eventual downfall. She felt that she had left her customers down. She told about the time when she was appearing at one of J.L. Hudson's outer-lying stores, and she was due for a 3 o'clock appearance. There were 600 people in the audience. Her flight was delayed. People were asked if they wanted to stay or not. They waited 3 hours. She said at that time, she felt like a rock star, and that she had a responsibility to her audience, and not a responsibility to seat people in the front row of a runway show, or to see if you could get close to Michelle so that you, like Jason Wu or Alexander Wang or any one of a number of others, with the exception, in my opinion, of Philip Sam, Peter Sam, had runway shows of clothes that by and large were not terribly wearable, but you were known because you had dressed Michelle Obama, Tom Ford had a show last night that was indicative, I think, of what's happened to our fashion business. All of his models were celebrities, and all delighted to be his models. What does that have to do with the fashion business today? And what does that really have to do with all of you? So that you can get eventually the one short paragraph, I think, that Kathy Horn gave Jason Wu yesterday, or get slammed like Alexander Wang did by saying, well, of course he's not a designer, but he's very, very clever. What does all of that mean to you as design students? People who, one way or the other, want to make an entry into the fashion world. Different world than it had been then. It's a world today that doesn't necessarily demand a point of view. That doesn't necessarily force you to believe in something. In reading, I think, a complete, full-page review of shows, the word taste was never mentioned. What is it tasteful to do? What do you believe in? What is your viewpoint? What are you willing to go out on a limb for? And how do you prepare yourself to do it? This is what Liz was all about. Her mother was a fantastic pattern maker and sewer, etc. Taught Liz all about how you make clothes. Her father was a man who loved museums and old churches. And if they were driving and riding in a train, he would say, get your nose out of the book, look out of the window. Learn how to see. Learn how to see out of all sides of your eyes. Learn how to be a humanist of a sort. It's the one thing that does very much impress me about Peter Sam, a Han Chinese, is that he had been taught the essentials of the humanities as well as the essentials of the craft, as Liz had been. So what did she do? When she turned 21, and I think this is in the book, she had loved to design, and unbeknownst to her parents, she entered a Harper's Bazaar contest. She was at that time living in New Orleans. Liz was born in Brussels, by the way, just as one of the dynamic duo who I'll be talking about shortly, Diane von Furstenberg, was. The other member of the dynamic duo being, of course, Anna Wintour. Very important people to know in the business who make things happen. Relationships. But Liz went about it quite differently. When she was 21, and as I said, she had entered this particular contest, and much to her astonishment and her parents' astonishment, because they didn't know about it, they at that point had moved back to New Orleans. Her family was an old Louisiana family. Her great-great-great-great-grandfather was the first governor of the state. And it was considered extraordinarily unladylike to enter a contest. To win it was virtually a venal sin. And she ended up winning it. And what was the prize? A trip to Paris to spend time with Jacques Heim, who in addition to everything else happened to have been Jewish, and a great deal of displeasure came out of that particular event. But when they got back to New York, Liz at that point was now 21. They stopped at a red light. Her mother was driving the car, and she said, "I'm getting out here." It's tough. "I'm going to be a designer." Her father said nothing. Opened up the trunk, gave her her bag, gave her a $50 bill, and said goodbye. And that's how Liz started in New York. She presented herself to the people at Harper's, and what with one thing and another, she became a do-everything girl. Get the coffee, get the pins, get the buttons, do this and that, buy yourself fall season model for Tina Leeser, who was in those days, a sportswear designer. And Tina Leeser just absolutely adored color. She didn't have the foggiest notion of how you put things together. But Liz learned to love color from Tina Leeser and learned all about colors that don't work together. But somehow they do, because she had the guts to do it. She left Tina Leeser, went to Omar Khayyam, who was a very, very high-class designer, so that she could learn more about the subtleties of fit. Again, it was a question of learning the trade. A number of jobs down the road, she became the head designer for a company called Youth Guild, a division of Jonathan Logan. I don't know if any of you remember Jonathan Logan. There once was a company called Jonathan Logan that made a variety of clothing and even went public. After a number of years, the folks at Jonathan Logan decided that it was time to get rid of Youth Guild. They asked Liz if she wanted to buy it as a partner with the people then running it. She asked me if we wanted to. And we finally decided, well, my two children were out of school. Her son was out of school and somewhat working. His schedule was just the opposite of ours. He was a guitar player. So he never knew that there were two 10 o'clocks in the same day. And we decided to take the risk. We would go into business. The phone rang early one morning. Helen Daniel, the buyer at Saks. In those days, buyers didn't have to be told by magazine editors who to follow. Called Liz and said, "I don't know what you're going to be making, but I want to be the first in New York to break an ad." And that's how it happened. The rest of the story, we brought on a fellow named Leonard Boxer because Liz said, "We don't do this without an engineer." Unfortunately, I think it was greed in the long run that did us in, and my lack of backbone in chasing volume. The only designer I can think of who stayed true to his calling. And when we went into business, he was merely a silk jacquard person for neckties, and I'm talking about Ralph Lauren. And Ralph was fortunate too, insofar as he brought on a man by the name of Roger Farah, who was a phenomenal businessman. And whatever Ralph did over the years, even though some errors were made, it had the Ralph Lauren stamp and the Ralph Lauren integrity, and we may all be tired of Ralph in jeans and a tuxedo and white sneakers receiving this award or that award. But Ralph has played the game with, I think, a great deal of integrity. We didn't. We opened divisions to create volume, so that in no time flat, Liz Claiborne dresses had nothing to do with Liz Claiborne. Liz Claiborne accessories had very little to do with Liz Claiborne. And when we left the company, there was a huge struggle going on as to how we should use the incredible financial edge that we had in the marketplace. Liz and I had no interest in a board struggle. Many other things interested us. We resigned in 1989, and I think you know what's happened to the company since. 1993 was a turning point. Let me go back to the book for a moment. After I had written the book and met Eric Wilson, who had interviewed Liz in, I think it was 2000, right after she knew she had the disease, and Eric at that. Do any of you know who Eric is, by the way? No. Eric Wilson is a journalist for the New York Times, and he covers the fashion industry. And his assignment these days is not to cover the clothes, but to cover who's sitting in the front row. Seriously. And I submitted the story to Eric, and he said, I'm not interested in that story. He said, that's a story about the gastric system. He said, I'm interested in what you guys did after you left the company. He said, I think what's great about what you guys did was that you just didn't go off and play golf or what have you. You started a foundation that was, well, it started the foundation in 1987, I believe it was, after a trip to Africa. Our great concern these days are wild tigers, of which there are only about 3,000 left in the wild. And we think that diversity is the hope of the world. And elephants. And I think I describe in the book Liz's epiphany at the Masai Mara, watching an elephant herd go by early one morning. At any rate, we got to the point where the company was unidentifiable. I wrote the book, I rewrote the book, and Eric said, and he became my editor. He said, I want to learn about what happened afterwards. Everybody knows about the company. Everybody didn't know about the company and the internal problems within the company. But what finally happened to the company, and it happens, I guess, to many, many companies, unless they're highly disciplined, is that breach that takes place between sales and design. Sales wants to go in one direction and will not be disciplined by design saying, no thank you. No thank you, I won't design that. I don't care if everybody wants it. That's not us. We have to be true to who we are and what I believe in. We didn't do that. And then after Liz and I left the company, downhill we went. And I think if any of you have been to J.C. Penney and seen what carries the Liz Claiborne label, I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post, by the way, called Liz Claiborne, J.C. Penney, Disaster. Liz known for color, Liz known for variety, Liz known for youth. At any rate, to sell the book, by the way, I was told that you have to go out there and market books, and you have to get on Facebook, and you have to post left and right, and which I did. There was a Liz Claiborne page on Facebook. I ceased posting, about a month ago. The books, we sold about 6,000 books in a tough climate, a tough subject, and it did what I wanted it to do. It kept Liz alive. The copies that we have here were published by the Missouri Botanical Garden because every agent turned me down. They said, the world wants to hear about the company. And I said, I'm sorry, this is the story I want to write. So MBG, which has a very small publishing wing, and Dr. Peter Raven, who was one of the great botanists of the world, said, sure, we'll publish it. And that's the book that you have. It was then taken on by a true publishing house called Taylor Publishing. We removed the photograph from the back. We received another blurb from Vera Wang. I don't know how many of you know Vera. Who's familiar with the name Vera Wang? Well, Vera reminds me of something that is happening these days, which is sort of sliding up and down the pole. No problem for Vera being with Coles. I find that admirable. No problem for Isaac, who's had his own problems one way or the other, having been at Target. No problem for a person I highly admire, who is a graduate of FIT, the great Norma Kamali, being at Walmart. I often wonder how Norma has time to design when it seems every day of the week she's receiving an award for this or that. But she has been true to her own sense of taste. So what is going to happen to all of you? Where do you get a job these days? First of all, I virtually beseech you to become expert at the craft, to to understand draping, to understand what is producible, what is not producible, to understand who your customer is. Is your customer the fifth floor at Barney's? Or is your customer broad? Oh, let's say like Lafayette 148's customer. I don't know. Are any of you familiar with Lafayette 148? A very, very great company that does all of its design and production in Shenzhen in China, of course. And but that is essential. Draping, knowing how to fit. I think in the book I describe, because most photographs of Liz, you'll see her with pins in her mouth, an event that took place in Hong Kong. We eventually, by the way, ended up with 8 offices overseas, which we visited constantly. When Liz crawled up on a cutting room table, and all of the people at this particular factory, the cutters, the pattern makers, watched her. She had a tracing wheel in her hand, and she worked on a pattern. She said, "See, I'm lifting the armhole. The reason I'm doing this because I want to bring the jacket a little bit closer to the body, and I want to give it a little bit more of a young look." And everybody smiled. And she did that a number of times, and they eventually applauded. The point was, she knew precisely what she was doing. Well, you all here can feel very, very pleased that Francisco Costa is a graduate of FIT. Calvin Klein is a graduate of FIT. And as I said, certainly Norma Kamali, Nanette Lepore, who designs for a much broader audience. And that FIT was the company that once was the institution that once recognized us as one company that makes a difference. I'm ready to answer questions of all kinds. So I'll sit down over here, I guess. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? Let me sit down before I fall down. There. I have one dead eardrum. Creates a balance problem. Can you hear me? Yes. Can I see you? Yeah. Yes.
What would you do differently, looking back on your life, on your career, even personal life? What would you do differently looking back?
I would not have married my first wife on her behalf. That's number one, because I didn't do her any favors. Nor do I think her parents should have permitted it. We were both much too young. Secondly, in fashioning the company, I would not have brought in as a fourth partner person in charge of sales. I think the sales element in any company of this nature must defer to design and engineering. Must. Otherwise, the company becomes incoherent. The company marches into the future looking backwards. Somebody called me about, a month ago and said the following. I'm so-and-so from such and such discount store in Boston, very good friend of your partner, the salesman, used to come to me and ask me what was selling so he'd come back and tell Liz what to design. No, I think sales must always take a back seat to design and engineering. That's what I would have done differently. Is there another hand anywhere? Yes. No more hands? Okey doke. Depends on so many things. There was an article in the paper the other day about 6 young designers. I don't know whether you read about it, or perhaps not so young. One being, I believe, Sophie Tilley. Is that how one pronounces her name? I don't know whether you read it. But a few years ago, there were the Antwerp 6 and this 6. And Sophie Tilley was one of the 6 selected this year as a real comer. She's not that young. But then the last paragraph, someone said, well, Sophie, how old do you think it's going to take you to make it? She said, well, right now there are only 3 of us. Me, the person at the machine, and the accountant who comes in occasionally. Well, you've got to come in with an edge. You either have to have had won a scholarship of one sort or another. You have to have caught the eye of the dynamic duo, or the editor of Marie Claire, or the editor of Harper's Bazaar. You have to have established yourself, and then you have to started a relationship with retailers. What do you bring to the marketplace that the marketplace will deem new, saleable? You yourself must have a certain amount of charisma. All of the people that we talk about, Jason Wu, Alexander Wang, Peter Sam, Fakun. We have here personable but not over the top personalities. To answer a question like that is really impossible. Tell me a little bit more about what you had in mind. You may never make a profit unless you go in. Alexander McQueen, of course, was a person of extraordinary brilliance in many ways, and making a profit wasn't necessarily what he was all about anyhow. But what you have to calculate, what do you have to offer that in any way is of the originality and almost nutty originality and brilliance of an Alexander McQueen. Who do you know? Who has seen your work? Who will support you to the stores, etc.? Anything further? It's an unanswerable question. Well, unfortunately, see, that question gets at the heart of what I consider a problem. I went to Wikipedia today for history of the fashion business. I went through the 1970s and the 1980s, not a mention of Liz Claiborne. Why not? Because she's seen as an entrepreneur. There's somehow something deficient. She was seen as an entrepreneur because the company was phenomenally successful. She had very little to do with the numbers. I was chief operating officer. I made myself vice chairman. And since I am garrulous but not necessarily interested in celebrities, Liz was the show. The pieces that I wrote for the Huffington Post, and I sent them to Dr. Brown, should really be an accompaniment to the book. Liz Claiborne, leadership. Liz Claiborne, the designer. Eventually, rewarding failure, which had to do with the board of directors. Because of the success of the company, I don't think she ever received the appreciation for the great sportswear designer that she was. And it was really during her period that sportswear became as important as it did become. That we had stores hang us together so that you could see the play back and forth between the various components, and still how important it was to be damn sure you had hot items simultaneously. So that, and we structured lines that way. We structured lines in terms of SKUs, stock keeping units. How does a Class A store buy? A Class B store, Class C? And you cannot have too much of this, that, or the other thing, because a Class C store for Macy's with too many stock keeping units will be broken after one garment is purchased. So knowing all of that is critically important for a large company. I don't know who is that large today. I know that aside from Ralph Lauren, and since Ralph Lauren sells so much merchandise in his own stores, and has learned the lesson, by the way, I'm sorry I've skipped over this, of the importance of designing handbags and designing shoes and eventually, as you probably all know, designing hamburgers for the left bank in Paris. And all of this begins with flattening out the cycles that you run into when you're dealing strictly with clothing. So that handbags, and everybody has bags these days, and good licensing when it comes to perfumes, shoes, and now, as I said, hamburgers, so that hopefully you have a cash flow that's 12 months of the year. Yes? Good.
Do you think there's a future for us designers that don't care so much about celebrity, or do you think it's going to keep spiraling?
I think you have to take celebrities and forget all about them. Yes, you have to enter contests. Yes, it's a pretty good idea to get to know magazine editors so that people get to know you. It's a great idea to be an attractive human being, not over the top in terms of the way you put yourself together. And be known for a point of view. This is the way I think clothes should look. Doesn't mean that you make the same clothes year after year after year, because you don't. If you take a look at some of the ads that Ralph runs, it's quite astonishing how feminine and yet still elegant in Ralph's way. No, I don't think you have to know celebrities. I think you're better off not knowing celebrities. Thank you. Yes? Yes.
You mentioned earlier that sales must always refer to design.
Yes.
Are there instances where it should be the reverse? For example, Christian Law, who just wasted LVMH money and never should not have.
With who?
Christian Law,
At?
LVMH.
I didn't hear that.
Christian Law, the designer,
Yes.
right, who was owned by LVMH, was owned by them, then made a profit in LVMH.
Right.
So I'm asking, do you think there's ever an instance where design should refer to sales? Obviously, you've done sales.
I think it's important that the merchandising people or the administrating people know the business clearly enough so that design is edited, design is informed. We take a case like the recent misfortune at Ungaro, in which Asid Abdullah, I think his name was, decided to buy the name. And I think even had Lindsay Lohan designing at one point. That was just a case of horrendous administration and merchandising. Bobby? Yes? Yes. I don't think you're satisfied with that answer, but
I'm just wondering if you're like a lot of designers who think they know everything. A lot of people here speak about design, but they have no idea about retail or buying a little buyer this.
well, I think we have to be very careful. It depends on who your designer is. Liz used to travel the country and work the selling floors and never tell the customer that she was Liz Claiborne. She'd go into fitting rooms with them and help them out and listen and listen and listen. And she learned an awful lot that way from the consumer herself. Liz always felt that she had to stretch the consumer, that she had to go beyond what the consumer thought she could wear. But she never went off on cloud nine and had any extraordinary sense that she knew everything there was to know, no. No, certainly you need input. Certainly you can't be arrogant. Yes. Yes. I didn't hear you. Yes. He, I was not there when he was there, by the way. So there's very little that I can answer because I have a view of management that I think is borne out by the results. I did write a piece called Rewarding Failure. I think Dr. Brown has copies, and that discusses the role of the board of directors. And that came after a book that was written called Money for Nothing, in which boards of directors were flayed for sitting and watching great companies go down the drain. I still have pieces from the original menswear lines, but after we left, there was internal problems in the menswear department. As far as I know, became very static for a period of time. So I can't answer that. Yes? The dynamic duo? Well, as we know, Diane von Furstenberg is a highly energetic and highly well-known person. And right now, I understand, is a pretty good line this year. Diane is fortunate enough to have the wherewithal to have become a prominent New York figure. And if Diane determines that our young lady friend here is dynamite and wants to see her do very well in business, she will introduce her to Anna Wintour, if she doesn't know Anna Wintour of Vogue, who's also very powerful. And I call them the dynamic duo because they're extraordinarily powerful in this industry. And it's a damn good idea to have them on your side. You're welcome. Yes? Can you say that again? What is the most important factor in? In what? What is the most important asset? Factor. Consistency in leadership. Always giving credit elsewhere. Never, ever create a public downgrading of anyone. Be the leading example of everything you preach. Somebody wrote to me that Liz was as beautiful inside as she was outside. She was a great entrepreneur because of the example that she set. There were once two great entrepreneurs. They formed a company called Hewlett-Packard. A book was written, In Search of Excellence, later on. What a shame what's happened to Hewlett-Packard since. Dave Packard led by walking. He knew everybody and knew their family. We at Liz Claiborne had no reserved parking for anyone at the warehouse. We had no separate dining room for anyone at the warehouse. Know your people. Know what's important to them. Know your business.